Hey everyone, Scott Hansen here from NFL Red Zone. I hope you're checking out 1 hour of 5 Yard Rush, one of the best podcasts on NFL football in the UK.
Hello, Rush Nation, and welcome back to the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast. As always, I'm your host, Liam, or at the FSA Tweets on Twitter, and we have an amazing guest coming up for you in a few minutes. But first, let me pass it over to my lovely co-host, as usual, Rich at Dynasty Island. How are you doing, buddy? It's a warm Tuesday in the UK. We're not used to this weather. Are you sweating as much as I am?
Well, yeah, I mean, I've just spent all day at Peppa Pig World, so I am incredibly hot and sweaty. I'm apologies for starting this a little bit late. It was my fault getting back delayed. So yeah, I've had a great fun day listening to the same tune on repeat all day. So yeah, very much up for talking Dynasty now.
And I'm sure, as you can hear in the background, his laugh. So you may know him from Twitter as the Trick Shot Guy. He does all sorts with a not medicine ball.
Yoga ball.
Exercise ball.
Yeah.
So his name is Joe Pepe. I got it right.
Got it
right. So at jpep20 on Twitter, he writes for FantasyPros and a host of other websites. Joe, how are you doing? It's been a long time coming getting you on the show for this year.
Yeah, man, I'm excited to be here. I'm doing pretty well. I keep forgetting that you guys are like nighttime compared to me, and I'm like, how did you do all this already? It's 3 p.m. But I'm catching up. I'll get there eventually. You know.
By the end of the show, you realize that we're about to go to bed, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. When you're falling asleep and yawning and I'm just wide awake, it'll all make sense.
Sounds good.
So, boys, the Scott Fish Bowl kicked off yesterday, 3 o'clock our time. For you, I think it was 10 o'clock Eastern over the seas. So, how's your Scott Fish Bowl draft going? Because I'm 3 rounds in at the moment. We're at the 406, but I've only made 3 picks. And it took a turn. I didn't think I'd be drafting the way that I am, but here I am. Rich, how's your draft going? And then we'll move over to Pepe.
Mine's very slow. We're only 3 picks in. I said to myself, I had 3 plans going into Scott Fish Bowl this year. Was don't leave the 301 without 2 QBs, invest heavily on elite wide receivers, and wait on running back. So through 3 rounds, I've got Cooper Kupp, Christian McCaffrey, and Derrick Henry. So as you can see, my 2 quarterbacks by the 301 has worked well. So yeah, I mean, look, the draft fell as it fell. I refused to reach. So yeah, the value's there. Let's all just pray that some sort of quarterback makes it back to me in the 4-5 turn, or I'm going to have a very short season. What about you, Joe?
I did the opposite of you, and I made sure I got my quarterbacks. I mean, I'm at the 105, so it was a little easier to get mine. But I got 2 quarterbacks. I got 2 tight ends. I got a stack with my tight end, receiver, and quarterback. I took basically every Raider that plays on the organization, it looks like. So I'm hoping for a really, really strong AFC West where the Raiders have to score like 40 points a game, and I'll be great. I'm about 8. I'm like 8 rounds though. I'm about 8 rounds in, so I don't. You got to tell your leagues like speed that up.
This is the one question though. Are all your guys in your league? Are you a local league? Are you all?
No. So I'm in Gotham. So okay. I'm in a non reality league, but everybody's pretty good. They stay like alive in the chat. We do have one guy who was actually in the Dark Knight movie, which is pretty cool.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah. Crazy.
Yeah, so it's a pretty good group. They haven't sniped me too much, and hopefully they're not listening today.
Nice. What about you, Lynn?
So I'm 3 rounds through, as I said. So I took Hurts in the first, and then forgot that I made a pre-draft list for the 2nd round pick, and ended up getting Christian McCaffrey. But I'm glad that I did, because after my Hurts pick, who was quarterback 8 off the board, Russ Wilson, Tom Brady, Aaron Rodgers, and Matt Stafford all went the next 4 picks, and it circled back to me. So I'll take Christian McCaffrey at the 203, and then Najee Harris at the 303. So quite happy with the way that that's gone. I kind of expected to get Brady or Rodgers maybe around the around my 203, but no, I'm happy with how it's going. And by the looks of it, I'm just going to punt quarterback and hope that none of my league are listening as well.
Yeah.
So today, enough redraft talk, and I say that, and we're about to talk more redraft. So today we are the 5 Yard Dynasty podcast as usual. So we always try to bring things around to the dynasty, but today we're going to be talking about redraft strategies that you can use in your dynasty leagues to basically help you and give you a bit of an edge around what everyone else is doing. Because in dynasty, a lot of people will look at the age of players, and that kind of informs a lot of decision making. Whereas in redraft, age goes out the window, and we all know that Rich is one of the biggest people that says quarterback age doesn't matter. So how can we apply that, not just the quarterbacks, but to other positions? Not saying that it doesn't matter entirely in dynasty, but maybe the dynasty community has got a bit too age happy and a bit too young in their mindset. So we brought Joe on, who is a redraft writer at FantasyPros, to basically give us some hints and tips on how he plays dynasty, because I've seen some of Joe's trades and they're quite interesting, including the one that he was drunk, thought that he was getting the pick, and he ended up giving someone away really, really cheaply. So
yeah, it was a rough day, man.
I had to bring that up. I just had to. So
forgot you're in that league.
I think we both are as well.
Yeah. So yeah.
But yeah, so we've got Joe on to talk about some redraft strategies you can use in your dynasty league. So to start off, Joe, when you're preparing for a dynasty league, this is not on the show sheet, so I'm throwing you a spanner in the works 7 minutes into the show. But how do you prepare for a dynasty league? Like, what's your preferred strategy? Are you much more of an ageist, or do you tend to play on your redraft kind of mentality from all your articles and try and bring that over into the dynasty world, I suppose?
For the most part, I try to play on my redraft side. I mean, there's always like teams falling to you in certain ways. You're like, you know what? Playing for 2 years from now. Like you build your team out a certain way. But for me, I love to play dynasty if I can in 1 to 2 year windows, and at most a 3rd year window. So the age doesn't bother me all too much. There's certain players I won't touch with a 10-foot pole. Like everybody knew Ben Roethlisberger was retiring last year, so I wasn't touching him last year. You know, simple things like that. But otherwise, like, give me the older people. Give me the people we're going to talk about later with the different running backs of like higher ages. If I can get 1 to 2 years out of them, I'm good. There's only a couple teams that I do big rebuilds with, and those are the ones I blow Rich's DMs up about.
Yeah, I think it's a great kind of approach, and I know Liam and we talk about people going to win now, and I think that sometimes people can play dynasty a little bit too like redraft. Not wanting to mention you, Joe, but I think there's a fine line, isn't there, between playing dynasty like redraft and being aggressive in the here and now, but not making moves that completely mortgage the future and that kind of thing. And I think that perhaps where Joe's being a little bit, should we say, humble, is that whilst he is very much redraft mindset and quite aggressive in trying to win in the here and now, he's not someone that will mortgage every pick in the future in order to try and win now. And I think that's the fine line that you perhaps need to tread.
So, Joe, we're going to come back to you with the first, I suppose, topic that we wanted to cover is comparing ADP and to find the discrepancies. So when we say ADP, it's average draft position for each player. And as a lot of people will know, in Dynasty, you have a massive difference between your redraft and your Dynasty ADPs, especially for the older players. I mean, some clear examples at the moment are Robert Woods and some players that are probably up there in age, but then in Dynasty, you probably don't want to draft them too early. Whereas in Redraft, as I said, you don't care about the age. So, Joe, do you look at Redraft ADP and Dynasty ADP and then try and mesh them together to see where your differences are? How do you rank your players, I suppose?
I do, but it's very much off of how my board is breaking down. So let's say like I got a guy behind me who I could tell is going for that win now. I want to win year one. I want to win year two. When I'm looking to see who's going to come back to me, I have to take into account the fact that like I should go look at the redraft rankings because he's probably going to pull on a player sooner. And I'm not trying to drop names that we're talking about later, but like he might go for an Aaron Jones sooner than a couple other people who you could tell are playing down the road for 2023, 2024. So I don't blend them together all too often. I do have one side where I'm like, okay, this is my dynasty rankings. And then as the board breaks down, then I kind of blend them. But that first couple of rounds are pretty solidified with, I feel like, the entire fantasy world at this point.
Yeah. And I guess the kind of the origin, if we may, of this whole kind of podcast and this whole theory was basically we were playing around with redraft ADP against dynasty ADP. And I very, very basic. I chucked them both in a graph. And it was really interesting because you could see what players were, Tom Brady is obviously much higher ranked in redraft than he is in dynasty. And a lot of the players made sense. But there were a couple of receivers that, quite frankly, jumped completely off the page at me that I would still consider, reasonably young, reasonably kind of well in that kind of win now window. Yet they're massively lower in dynasty ranks than they are in redraft. So we'll start with the first. We'll leave the hot name for later, Joe. But the first guy, so Mike Williams, he's only 27. He is currently this is 4for4's multi-site ADP as the wide receiver 17. But in Dynasty, he's going as the wide receiver 33. So do you think that this is a massive value from a Dynasty perspective? Do you think that people are concerned that he's approaching that age cliff? Or do you just think that this is a guy that we should all be going out and buying right now?
In this situation, I feel like he's a great buy because, one, he just got the contract. So, the Chargers won him. They gave him his money. He's there with a great young quarterback. But the thing to me isn't so much his age that I'm looking at. I'm looking over at Keenan Allen's age and him falling apart a little bit. And if he falls off, let's just say, a cliff entirely and loses out a whole nother step, then Mike Williams has to progress for these Chargers to make the playoffs, to be a force in the NFL. I'll take that shot at Mike Williams there, where everyone's like, oh, I'll take the comfortable shot with Keenan Allen. I know what he gives me. He's done it forever. He's got to go off that cliff eventually. So I'm going to go with Mike Williams, possibly taking over the wide receiver one this year. And that's something that I like to do with like my startups is I push the running backs all the way down and just give me as many wide receiver ones that I can get. And if I can get Mike Williams to fall into that, perfect.
Yeah, I think it's weird, isn't it? Because you've got to look at, we're talking about Mike Williams going, I'm trying to look at ADP now, but I think he's going 9 picks after Keenan Allen in terms of from Dynasty. Yet in redraft, they're pretty much in the same ballpark of where they're going. Keenan Allen's the wide receiver 10 and Mike Williams wide receiver 17. So even though Keenan Allen's older, they're closer together in redraft than Dynasty. And for me, it's a massive disconnect. And I can't quite get my head around quite why the Dynasty community is so low on him, yet the redraft community is saying this is a wide receiver 2 this year.
It's wild to me. It's very wild to me because I get it. Mike Williams comes with that boom bust approach to his game, but the Chargers paid him. They know that he plays 4 strong games and disappears for 2, 4 strong games, disappears for another 2. But Keenan Allen just gives you that one nice steady pace, and that's great until he can no longer give you that steady pace. Then he is an absolute trash item on your team. And I'd rather get the shot at somebody who can go higher than the guy that I know is going to give me the middle to bottom floor.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it ties into your 2-year window of Mike Williams. You said about his contracts. He's going nowhere for the next 2 years. He's tied to Justin Herbert. Who wouldn't want that? It's an ideal option, isn't it? Sorry, Liam, I interrupt you.
I mean, you brought it perfectly onto what I was going to speak about is the contract situation there. So Keenan Allen, as of right now, can be cut for savings. I'm not saying that he's going to be cut before the 2022 season, but at any point in his contract now, he's got 3 more years, including this year, left on his contract. But he can be cut in any of the next off seasons while he's under contract. For next year, I think it's like a 14 million saving or something along those lines. Now, yes, you've got to replace Keenan Allen with that 40 million, but that's still a significant saving. And then when you look at Mike Williams' contract, he's got 2 years basically guaranteed unless he absolutely falls off a cliff and doesn't do anything whatsoever, where he's going to be on that roster, as Rich said, tied to one of the best young quarterbacks in the current game. I think that there is a massive disconnect here. And do you see that a lot, Joe? Is that something that you look out for in your dynasty, like when you're ranking your dynasty players and when you're looking at your draft board? Is that something you're constantly paying attention to, is these discrepancies, or is it you kind of decide there and then?
I think it's something that when I'm building my rankings out, it's always in the back of my head, but I'm not building my rankings based on that. It just kind of flows. Like we said, Keenan was 9 picks ahead. When I see Keenan Allen's name popping up in like drafts or in my rankings, I'm like, okay, wait, where did I put Mike Williams? Because I don't want to keep them too far apart, and I want one possibly ahead of the other. And I'm big on Mike Williams because not only is Keenan Allen old, but Austin Eckler's getting up there. So if he falls off too, and Keenan Allen starts to fall off too, the youngest option there, not counting like Joshua Palmer and all that stuff, like, is Mike Williams, the guy who they just paid. And there's a reason they paid them. And the NFL organizations know more than we do. Like, they know that eventually the cliff is going to come for these people. That's why they got Spiller. That's why they gave a contract to Mike Williams. I feel like the tide could turn there. So, yeah, I keep it in mind, but, kind of changes from each situation, from like the Chargers to the Bills to whoever.
So let's start talking about the running backs then, because we obviously just spoke about the wide receiver age kind of there. So in Dynasty...
Hang on, Liam. You skipped out the hottest name in Dynasty and Twitter circles at the moment.
I was going to say that a little bit later. A little bit later, but let's go into it because Rich really wants to talk about it, obviously. So the hottest name on Dynasty Twitter right now is Gabe Davies at the wide receiver position. Currently the wide receiver 2 for the Buffalo Bills. Now, me and Rich have been very vocal on our decision on, or our stance on Gabe Davis as why would you take Gabe Davis when you can get Jamison Crowder much, much later for much, much cheaper, and you've got less of a need for Crowder to hit, whereas with Gabe Davis, with his current ADP, you need him to work out, else you've just wasted a top 10 round pick in Dynasty startups, which you don't want to do. Now, Joe, I'm going to just hand this over to you because I have a feeling you're going to be in the similar boat to us, but at the moment, he has a massive discrepancy between his redraft and his Dynasty ADPs. Now, how do you feel about him, both in redraft and in Dynasty? Because I suppose that's what this is kind of about, this episode, is you're using your redraft rankings to help in your Dynasty league. So how do you feel about Gabe Davis going into this season and therefore into the future as well?
So for me with Dynasty, I'm not grabbing Gabe Davis anywhere because the price, all the allure that's being talked about on Twitter, he's just costing too much for me to even want to get him. But I do have him in redraft, but he's my 5th receiver. I waited terribly long, and he ended up being there, and I said, screw it, that's what I'm going to do, because I usually go a lot of receivers first and then backs later. I don't understand the hype as much as other people are getting in. Like, it just doesn't make sense to me. Like you guys said, Jamison Crowder, he's coming in. They brought in James Cook, pass-catching option there. Obviously, Stephon Diggs is still there. If you have any belief in Dawson Knox, even though he's touchdown dependent, another option there. My thing is for redraft is I'm actually really high on Stephon Diggs because I think it's much easier to predict that Gabe Davis won't live up to this ADP than it is to say that Gabe Davis is absolutely going to shatter this ADP. So if Gabe Davis doesn't perform the way that 85% of Twitter apparently thinks he's going to, you're going to have to ultra target Stephon Diggs this year. So he's my number 3 in redraft. Like, it's not even close. Like, it's JJ and it's Cooper Kupp are the top 2, like, give or take whoever goes 1 or 2, and then it's Diggs.
I can get on board with that. I think for me, and this goes back to this graph idea, is that I can't get my head around how a 23-year-old wide receiver that's going as the wide receiver 25 in redraft, yet is the wide receiver 38 in Dynasty. And it's like somebody's wrong here. Either the redraft community are very wrong and he's being massively overhyped, which I kind of lean towards that, or the Dynasty community are far too slow and, far too held up and caught up on the draft capital idea. And, I'm one that always sits here and says day 3 wide receivers don't matter. So perhaps it's sticking to the brand and I've got to hate on Gabe Davis and I can't admit that he's ever going to be a thing. But I just can't get my head around it that, somebody's got to be wrong and somebody's going to have massive egg on the face. And we could be sitting here in a year and people in Dynasty have been far too slow and you've got a potential, future star that's going to be 24 years old and that kind of thing. But
it happens too much with redraft. Like, it was very easy last year. My person to avoid in redraft was Chase Claypool. And everybody was like, he's young. He scored 9 touchdowns, even though he had 4 of them against my Eagles. Like, it was very simple to point it out. And now this Gabe Davis stuff is shooting that ADP even higher than Claypool got to last year. And it's too rich for my blood. I know he had that amazing playoff game, and I think that's what stuck in the redraft brain for people. And you have to just kick it out because, one, it doesn't matter your fantasy team, what he did in the playoffs. And then 2, it's one game. We've seen so many people go nuts for one game that it doesn't even matter. Who was the running back for the Patriots who scored 4 touchdowns and then was like the special teamer for the next 6 weeks?
I want to say
it's going to play on Rich's mind now.
He got cut. Didn't he get cut the next week? Because
it was. I can't remember his name right now.
Jonas Gray, but
it sounds right.
Was it Jonas Gray?
Somebody go with that.
Move on here. I'm gonna sit with me for a while. That,
but on the Gabe Davis stuff, I mean, I understood a bit of his rookie season. He was getting a good % snap share, but then last year he only had 4 games over 60% snaps. And that all came towards the end of the season. I mean, I'm talking purely regular season here, so in the playoffs that might have been a little bit different, but it definitely comes down to recency bias. He had that 85-yard 2-touchdown game in week 15 against Carolina, and then he also had that massive, was it 3 or 4 touchdowns game in the playoffs as well for the Bills. So it definitely comes down to a recency bias. But as Rich is already away Googling something,
it's
Joe.
It was Jonas Gray. 201 yards, 4 touchdowns, and then was cut 2 weeks later.
That's what I mean. Like, things happen.
But back on the Gabe Davis stuff, last year, how many games did he have over 10 points in PPR?
Offhand, I do not know that, but I'll take a guess.
Just have a guess.
3. We'll say 3.
Okay, a little bit more than that. I'll give Rich a hint. Rich is furiously typing to try and find out. He had 6. He had 6.
Okay.
And out of those 6 games, how many games do you think he had a touchdown in over those 10? So 1 or multiple touchdowns within those 6 games.
We're going to stick with the brand today. We're going to go 3.
Stick with 3.
I guess all of them.
All but 1, so you were close, Rich. But that's my point is, we're talking about Dawson Knox as being hugely touchdown dependent, but the only time, apart from 1 game out of the 5, he had to have a touchdown to score over 10 points. That's not someone I want on either my redraft or my dynasty team. And I think people are putting way too much stock into the whole, Cole Beasley's gone, Emmanuel Sanders has gone. I'm trying to think of some of the other names now, but all of these players have gone, and everyone's forgetting about Jamison Crowder in round 15 or whatever is going in, if not even later than that in Dynasty. So I think a lot of people are doing what me and Rich both hate is target share just being passed over from one player to the next when that's not going to happen. So let's get off the Gabe Davies talk because that's probably ruined our viewership for Twitter anyway. Everyone's gone away now and done whatever with their evening, or if you're in the US, in your early afternoon, Joe.
Yeah.
But let's move on to the running backs before Rich rudely interrupts me again. So, as I was saying earlier, in Dynasty, you tend to have this age 26 cliff where you basically can't sell a running back for their value anymore once they hit that major age cliff, even if they're still performing. So we've seen guys like Zeke Elliott, who is around the age now, but has actually performed pretty well over the course of the season. For the past few seasons, we've got Derrick Henry in the same situation. Christian McCaffrey's kind of getting there. If he gets a mediocre season this year, I could probably see him around that age as well. But Joe, how do you deal with running backs? You spoke earlier that you're more happy to take some of these older running backs. How much does that age 26 gap or cliff play into your rankings? Because I'm assuming from a redraft point of view, a 1 to 2 year window, it doesn't matter as much if they're hitting that age. Maybe that's the guys that you're targeting, I suppose.
Yeah, I don't really play age too much into the with my dynasty, because like I was saying earlier, I like to get the guys that I know are going to be around for about, let's just say 7 to 10 years. The quarterbacks, the wide receivers, load up on the wide receiver ones throughout the league, get a couple quarterbacks, and then I'll use my draft capital to go get these running backs, these aging guys, or even in a startup where they might fall beneath a few of these wide receivers, so that I look like I'm going like zero running back. But I'm getting a guy like we're going to talk about, a Zeke, or I've gotten Connor a couple times. He's up there a little bit. Aaron Jones is somebody I have been targeting everywhere for the next 2 years, because I think for the next 2 years, and that's kind of where I just play my windows of running backs, is very, very short. I think he's going to be fantastic. And in a year and a half, if my team's not really working out and I don't like the build, well, then I sell them off to somebody who's competing, who needs that last 5-6 games to win a title.
So, Rich, where do you want to go with this one, mate? Because we both know that you, with a quarterback position, you don't care about age, but running backs, does that change for you in Dynasty?
Yeah, I think there's a really delicate balance with running backs, and I think that perhaps people take it too far and view running backs in sort of 2 age windows, and I think there's actually 3. And I realize I'm doing my hands and people can't actually see what's happening. But so I think that there's the point at which you get the majority of a running back's production, which is in that first 3 to 4 years of their career. Everybody knows that that's where they want running backs. You want to draft them ideally in your rookie drafts. You want to get peak value from them whilst they're good. And then you enter that second stage where, and this is where I'm one of those people that bangs the drum of, you want to sell every running back you've got at the peak of their value as they're hitting that second contract, because as soon as they sign that second contract, their value stays where it is, but it's about to plummet. And that's the point at which I want to sell all of my running backs that are at that age cliff. And people view that's what you do with running backs. But then I think there's that third window that people kind of forget about. And, we've got Aaron Jones, Liam and I, we've talked about it a few times, where the perfect time to sell him was just before he signed that contract. As soon as he signed that contract, people were like, 4 years. It was actually only ever going to be 2 years. But now people have started to get it. And his price has plummeted. But because his price has plummeted, I'm now very interested in him, because I'm not having to spend, he's not a really high-priced player on my roster that I know is going to decline in price. But now Liam, you might have to help me out here. Off the top of my head, he's running back 20 in ADP, running back 25, something like that.
Are we talking Dynasty ADP?
Yeah, in terms of Dynasty ADP. Running back 20. He's running back 20 at the moment. There you go. So he's already being cast aside as being too old. But if I can spend that cost to acquire him for 1 year of production, That's fantastic. You know, I've got Aaron Jones is currently ranked. I think I've got him as a top 5 running back this year in terms of my redraft rankings. Like he's going to be a stud. Everybody knows it. So if you can spend to acquire him, knowing that you're going to get no resale value, but you're going into that move knowing you're getting no resale value, whatever you spend to acquire him, you're basically lighting on fire for this 1 year. I think it's fantastic. And I think that people forget about that third window when it comes to running backs. People focus on get them young, get the production, sell them when they hit peak value. But then there's that buy them late for that kind of twilight of their career. And, you know, worst case scenario, Aaron Jones has a slow start to the year, isn't particularly fantastic. AJ Dillon takes over, the Packers offense struggles, whatever. What's the worst you've spent? Probably a late first, maybe a couple of seconds. Like he's going that cheap at the moment. I'm happy to take that punt on the potential of a top 5 running back that I think Aaron Jones is this year.
I mean, Aaron Jones is a perfect example, but we could expand this to other options as well. I mean, you've got Zeke Elliott that's going at RB 22 at the moment. You've got Fournette at 24. I mean, some of these guys, you're looking in redraft, and where are you taking them at the moment, Joe? You've probably done a lot more redrafts than me and Rich because we've been too busy with the Dynasty brain at the moment. But where are you seeing them going? Running back 12 to 15?
In my redrafts, like from because I wrote it all down here, I didn't want to not have it. So I have Aaron Jones first. He's around the 9th back coming off for the majority of the drafts that I'm in. Leonard Fournette is right after him or right before him. He's either 8 or 10, but he's around 10 mostly for 10th overall. And then Zeke is the furthest one down out of the 3 you just named. He's around 17 to 20, somewhere in there. A lot of people are scared off from him. If I could get a Zeke in that 4th, 5th, that has happened a couple times for me, all day. I'll smash that all day for the redraft side. Give me that every time.
But that's my point, is there's a massive disconnect between the Dynasty and the redraft side. And some of that does come down to contract situations. But this is the point we're trying to make, I suppose, is have a look at your leagues, have a look at your Dynasty leagues, and have a look at people's contracts, players' contracts, because that's where you can really get an edge. I mean, Aaron Jones, me and Rich have been saying for the past year that he's only got this year left, but I'm starting to think that he might have 2. And even if he goes to a new team, I think Aaron Jones is still going to be as good as he is now. But I think that if you get 2 years out of him on the Packers, that's still a really good buy in Dynasty.
And
for sure.
And I think so. I'm gobsmacked at where his price is. So I'm just on the DLF Trade Finder right now. So some real life. These are real life trades from real leagues. So recently we've seen Zeke Elliott go for 2 second-round picks. We've seen Zeke Elliott go for a 2nd and a 3rd. We've seen Zeke Elliott go for Michael Gallup and Logan Thomas. We've seen Zeke Elliott go for Jared Goff straight up, for James Robinson, a late 2nd and 2 thirds. You could
take Zeke in all of those.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Okay, Zeke, this is probably your last year. Zeke is, I don't think, going to be a top 12 running back this year.
No.
But you can't buy solid, steady RB2 production for two third-round picks. That's insane.
I think it's something I like to say to people all the time that are jump in my DMs. It's every player is available for a trade depending on the right price, and everybody is available to buy. If that's the price for Zeke Elliott and that's all that person wants all day, take it. It's not even a question.
And to be honest, maybe this is a really good rebuild buy. And I appreciate that seems slightly mental. Go out and buy a running back that's potentially in the last year of his contract and year with the Cowboys. But if you can go out and buy Zeke Elliott in a rebuild for 2 thirds, maybe a 2nd and a 3rd, I'll tell you what, in September, once players start getting injured, I can guarantee that you'll be able to sell Zeke for more than a 2nd and a 3rd.
Yeah. Well, that's what happened with me with James Conner last year. And then I wasn't ready to make the playoffs in this league. I got James Conner, and I did it just to flip him. And as soon as Chase Edmonds went down, like mid-season, I forget which week it was, I got a first and a second for James Conner. I was like, yeah, deal. Like, I only like traded off a second and a third to get Conner. So I moved up with my assets. So that's sometimes you get players like that just to do that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, we touched on Leonard Fournette being the third guy there, and as you said, he's a top 10 back by most people this year. Yet he's going as RB24 in Dynasty. If we all talk about running backs only having 1, 2, maybe 3 years of production, well, give me a top 10 running back at RB3 prices.
Oh, all day. Give me Leonard Fournette. He's attached to Tom Brady. Maybe he could put the snacks down. I would appreciate that. But other than that, like, there's nobody else there. I'm not worried about, oh my God, I'm blanking on his name right now. The running back that they draft.
Rashad White.
Rashad White. Like, I'm not worried about him. I'm not worried about Keyshawn Vaughn because they went out and drafted another running back. Leonard Fournette is who Tom Brady trusts. And if Tom Brady trusts him, he's gold.
And I really like Rashad White. I think he's got potential. I think he's, ticks a lot of boxes. But look, Tom Brady doesn't like rookies. Tom Brady has never liked rookies. If you're telling me that a rookie is going to come into a Tom Brady offense and take Leonard Fournette off the field, who showed last year that he can do everything, and I mean everything in terms of pass catching, running between tackles, running outside tackles, the pass protection, he ticks all those boxes that Tom Brady wants. And I think the more time Leonard Fournette spent on the sidelines, the more upset Tom Brady's going to be. And we all know that Tom Brady runs that team.
Yeah, I mean, it's Tom Brady's team. Like you said, Leonard could do everything. Tom doesn't like rookies. And the fact that, like I said, 1 to 2 year windows is how I play, and 1 to 2 year window for Fournette is where I'm thinking. And let's just say 6 games of that, Godwin might be gone on top of it all. And then Godwin has to come up to speed too. So let's just say 8 total games. Let's say that happens. You now have a strong 8 games or so of Leonard Fournette being more of a focus point for your team. So I'm taking that shot, because even if that doesn't work out in that sense, then like you said, you find somebody who is competing better than you and flip them. But I'll take the shot every time.
So let's move on, because we've spoken about running backs for quite a while, and we said at the start of the show we weren't going to get into specific players, and it seems like that's what we've done. So let's talk a bit of theory this time, and let's try and keep it to theory. But we know that you have somewhat of a bromance on Twitter with Tom Strachan from also FantasyPros writer, Best Ball UK, or T-Strack as you may know him on Twitter. Now, we didn't put this in, or I'm assuming Rich didn't put this in for this comment of bromance, but we're going to start talking about a bit of stacking and more around roster construction. Now, Tom loves his stacking in redraft, and especially in his best balls. Do you like stacking in your redraft, or is it kind of like if it happens, brilliant. If not, then I'm not worried about it. And how can you take that into like Dynasty? Do you look at trying to make those stacks happen in Dynasty as well?
So with redraft, I don't like line up as much as Tom does to get the stack. But if it falls to me, fantastic. Like, easiest example is my Scott Fishbowl. I ended up with Derek Carr in the second round, and when Devontae Adams came back, it was a no-brainer. I had to go back-to-back there, and then somehow Darren Waller came and I got the double stack, but that's a whole nother story. But I like to stack when it happens. I don't go looking for it in redraft, because then I feel like you tend to overthink it and you jump players who you just should have over the person you're trying to stack with. But in Dynasty, I definitely try to stack something. I might not always have the top stack of, like, let's just say for Tom's sake, Trey Lance and Deebo Samuel. Doesn't always have to be that. It doesn't have to be Trey Lance and, Kittle. Could be Trey Lance and Jennings. I can get something later. I like to make my later guys try to stack with my quarterbacks, because they're kind of dart throws anyway, and I'm kind of hoping they pop off. And if they pop off, that means the quarterback's doing better anyway, and then I'm reaping the reward from both sides.
So, Rich, how do you feel about stacking, especially in Dynasty?
Yeah, I think perhaps I'm sort of a reluctant stacker. I think it's something Tom and I have talked about for on and off probably for about 18 months. And I think he's finally starting to wear me down and see the benefits of stacking. From a dynasty perspective, I think I like it, but I'm perhaps the opposite of Joe in that I quite like if I've got an established, elite quarterback, I'm quite like going out and trading for his number one target. I certainly did it. I'm in a Devi league that I won back to back, and I went out and traded for. I had Josh Allen, and I went out and traded for Stephon Diggs halfway through last year because I quite like the idea of having those two to stack together down the kind of playoffs to hopefully take them to a title, and it worked. And I think that I can definitely see the benefits of stacking. It's not something like you, Joe, that I kind of try to go out of my way to do. If it happens, great. If I can, get a good trade at value and it helps me complete a stack, then fine. But it's not something that I'm going to go and overpay in a trade to get a stack or reach in a draft to certainly go and get. But I mean, sticking, I guess, perhaps on the roster construction side, Joe, I think we talk so much about roster construction, particularly in best ball, but we also talk about it in redraft. And you talk about hero RB or zero RB. Do you look at your overall roster within a dynasty league, whether that's 25 spots, 30 spots? Are you analyzing what you're doing with your bench spots, how you're constructing that bench spot to the same way you are in redraft, or is it just a case of you're going out and getting the 25 best players and however it falls is how it falls?
It's changed recently. I've been more of a fan in a few startups that I've done where I start, like I was saying, quarterback and wide receiver heavy, and I get these really loaded up guys, like these wide receiver ones everywhere. And then I kind of load my bench with the backup running backs or, different like the Madisons of the world and Hendersons of the world. And that sometimes is like my new favorite way to go about it. But for the most part, I'm just like, okay, give me top 25 that I can get right here. I'll worry about it, because like I said, 1 to 2 year windows, but I try to play in. So for the most part, I'm like, give me my best guys. Let's throw the best team I can onto the field and hope that I win. But I do lean into it a little bit saying like, I'm going to probably go wide receiver a lot earlier and running backs later, because if these wide receivers all hit and my team is really good and I only need to fill 2 spots with running backs, take that 2023 first, take that 2024 first, have them, give me those running backs, I'm set. That's kind of my thought process, because most leagues are 2-3 wide receivers and a flex or something like that. I just feel like there's more spots I have to fill there, and I want to make sure I'm safe there and I could play wild card with the running backs.
What about you, Liam? Are you I guess analyzing and focusing on that roster construction, or is it something that you're just top 25 players, top 30 players and go from there?
I mean, from a startup point of view in Dynasty, I kind of do think maybe do I want, especially in Superflex, where do I want to take my quarterbacks? Because that's a big thing, both in Redraft and in Dynasty. You want those quarterbacks that are going to do well. But I suppose when it comes down to running backs, I'm a bit more flexible, as Joe does. He likes his wide receivers first, and that kind of tends to be the way that I draft in Dynasty. In Redraft, I tend to fancy the running backs a bit earlier on, and because I know that I can get that value later with the wide receivers. But I don't tend to immediately think of or go into a draft of ever, this is what my roster construction is going to be, or this is my preferred roster construction. I'll always go in flexibly, and it will be 3 or 4 rounds before I actually think where I want to go with my roster. When it comes to redraft, I tend to have to make that decision a lot quicker, because of if you don't, you're just picking up random players and then your roster doesn't make sense. Whereas with Dynasty, at least you can trade a lot more and it's a lot easier to trade. So for me personally, I know that Rich is a big fan of this tactic, but taking 1 or 2 running backs early and then picking up a bunch of later round guys just to sit on the bench and hope that they get some significant time. And then that's how you get that increased value, especially in Dynasty. I mean, in Redraft, it's you can still do the same thing. But I'm a lot more. I look at the wide receiver value a lot more in my redraft leagues for those later bench spots. Rich, how do you go about it?
Yeah, I think I guess this is perhaps a twofold question. I think in startups, I tend to agree with you, is that I'm looking to accrue as much roster talent as I can. I think to a point, I think probably after, and it depends on every league and every setup and everything like that, but after we get to probably about 15 rounds, I'm almost opting out at the wide receiver position, because I think that the chances, and I've looked at this a few different times, but the chances of wide receivers ranked outside of like the top 50, 55 becoming a startable player down the line for you is pretty slim. And for me, those wide receivers tend to basically become roster cloggers. And there's the guy that you're like, oh, but he's the wide receiver 3 on his team, and he'll have like 3 or 4 good weeks in the season. You're like, see, there's the talent there. And then you look back after 3 years and he's sat on your bench and you've carried him for 3 years, and at no point have you felt comfortable enough starting him, but he's too good to cut. And I think that that's the type of player that I just hate rostering. So at that point, those back end roster spots, I always try to opt for what I class as volume-based positions, which are quarterback and running back, because, you can put in Joe Bloggs off the street at running back, and if he's going to get 20 carries in a game, if he's going to get 15 carries in a game, he's immediately fantasy relevant. And it might be that you don't start him, but there'll probably be someone in your league that'll give you a late second or a third round pick for them. And it's the exact same quarterback. I've seen trades where David Blau got traded in a Dynasty League for a second round pick because someone was desperate for a quarterback that week. Absolutely mental. But it happens every year. I can guarantee this year there will be a quarterback injured. The backup will come in, and the person who rosters them will probably end up trading them for a profit. So I think that, I try to buy into talent over everything. Let's get the best value players on my roster. But I do think that those back end roster spots, I'm looking more for players that have got the potential to accrue value. And for me, and the way I play, that tends to be those volume based positions. Looking from a redraft perspective, I guess it's difficult because you've got much shorter benches, haven't you? So I guess I'm much more likely, to be honest, I kind of play redraft very similarly in that I build around receivers, and then I'll just basically load my bench with running backs and hope some of them hit. So I guess I'm probably quite similar into stealing that from redraft to dynasty.
Well, it's hard. Like, the one thing I like to do with like my dynasty leagues is if I get to a spot where I'm like, okay, who do I want, the running back or the receiver here? One of them has a chance of a higher shelf life than the other. So I'm always going to take that in the beginning rounds, like I'm always going to take the wide receiver over the running back in the first few rounds, and then I'll get my running backs later. But like you said, in redraft, I'm a little different. I try to get like at least the one for hero ball, and then I'll just load up on wide receiver and go pick up the backups that I can. And for me, I love Chase Edmonds, and I keep getting him in the 9th. So I'm pretty set in my mind in redraft. But it's, I won't shut up about him.
You and me both fall in on Chase Edmonds, although I am fuming because he's literally just been sniped 1 pick ahead of me in the JTT Cup. So I've gone, it's a best ball, 10-team leagues. I think I've gone 9 wide receivers in my first 11 picks, along with 2 quarterbacks. Chase Edmonds was going to be my first running back, and he got sniped the pick before me, so I was fuming.
That's kind of my goal in the Scott Fish Bowl, because like I just got AJ Dillon. I'm like, if Chase Edmonds gets back, I'm just going to hammer that and then just call it a day. I'll go to running backs way later. I'll worry about it then. But Chase Edmonds is my guy, and because of him this year in his ADP and redraft, I feel like hero ball is the best setup, which is my next Fantasy Pros article, is me doing an early position mock draft, and I kind of just hammer home wide receivers and then eventually hit those running backs, and I lucked out, thankfully. I can't say too much because I feel like Fantasy Pros will smack me upside the head, and I got to keep quiet till it comes out.
When's it dropping?
It's supposed to be this week, but with the holiday, everything kind of got a little junked up. So Yeah, well, our holiday, obviously not yours, but our holiday. So we're a little behind. So it'll be out this week, hopefully.
Sounds good.
So where can everyone find your work? Obviously, you've got FantasyPros there, but I know you write for some other sites, and we didn't cover them right at the start. I just said a whole host of other sites. So where can everyone find your work, Joe?
So you can find my work at Triple Play Fantasy, where I do the Tripwire podcast with Zach, Alex, and a newcomer, Steve, today. So when it drops Thursday, you'll get to see him. I do some things with Club Fantasy FFL, and we do what's called Dunking on Joe, where we kind of have like a PTI set up, and I ran for 5 minutes. Somebody else rants for 5 minutes, and then we let Twitter vote on it. But those are the three sites. So you got Fantasy Pros, you got Triple Play, you got Club Fantasy FFL, and then you obviously got my stupidity in between on Twitter at JPep20, where I just do trick shots and post my girlfriend's dog way too much.
I mean, dog pictures are always welcome on Twitter. Let's not pretend.
No.
Oh, Rich.
Yeah.
No, I'm at the point where I'm considering muting Joe. Far too many dog pictures for my liking.
Need
so
some
cute.
more trick shots, mate.
All right, I'll make
Yeah.
some trick shot back.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's been busy in the gym because like people are coming back from COVID, and work from home. So we're actually busy again. And I'm like, oh, you guys are in my way. Like I need to kick this ball. So I got to find like a good point of the day where it's quiet, and I'll bring it back for you.
Sounds
I'm
good. Look
just
forward
hearing
to it.
excuses, Matt. Just hearing excuses. Joe, at the end of every show, we tend to do a Dynasty Tip. Now, I know we haven't asked you for one, but can you think of one off the top of your head right now? If not, don't worry, we've got backups. But can you think of a Dynasty Tip for all of our listeners that you basically just want them all to know and think that they all should be implementing in their Dynasty leagues?
Yeah, something that I deal with a lot of people is being afraid to trade your draft capital. Nobody knows what's coming in a year. Nobody knows what's coming in 2 years. You do have a better shot of figuring it out in the next couple months for 2022, though. So don't be afraid if you're right on the edge and you need to make the playoffs and you're about to become a contender and you need like 1 or 2 more pieces. Trade that capital. Don't do a stupid trade, but be willing to trade that capital.
Perfect, right? So that is the end of the show, guys. This time next week, we will be speaking to you after the very first UKFFC that me and Rich are excited for. Joe, you're going to have to come over 1 year, maybe
Definitely
next year. But yeah, it'll be. I'm putting pressure on you now. You've got.
Listen, I'm vacation. I'm there. Like,
but yeah, very first UKFFC on Saturday as of recording the 16th. So. We'll be speaking about that a little bit next week, but not too much. So until then, guys, thank you, Joe, for coming on. Rich,
thank you.
I'll see you next week as usual. And remember, guys, keep going. Cheers.